Land reform versus socialism. In addition to these two, but one other remedy is proposed, socialism, a term that is variously used to include all sorts of radical schemes, some of them meaning little more than land reform itself, and others so drastic as to make the conservative world shudder at the very name. And our civilization is rapidly approaching the point where it must choose between the revolutionary program of the extreme socialist and the middle of the way policy of the land reformers. The land reformers propose an evolution of our present civilization by which we may retain all the good of the existing order based on natural law and tested through many centuries of human experience, while abolishing by well-tried methods those special privileges which have made it possible for the few to exploit the many and to appropriate the fruits of their labor. The extreme socialists propose a revolution, the most sweeping in the history of the world. To get rid of the evils of the present social order, they would abolish it entirely and attempt to set up in its place an artificial system that has been worked out to order on paper. Land reform would leave every man with as his own master, the beneficiary of his own labor, the arbiter of his own destiny, with every inducement to endeavor that has thus far been the guiding star to perfection in the individual and the race. Socialism in its advanced stage, to save the masses from the slavery of present wage conditions, would make all men slaves to the state, constituting them mere parts in a vast machine that would repress all tendency to individual initiative, and render needless and obsolete those qualities of self-reliant manhood and womanhood that are essential to both the physical and moral progress of humanity. And what is more to the point of this discussion, land reform is based on honesty in that it would ensure to every man the product of his own labor and none other, while socialism at its worst is allied with dishonesty in that it seeks to assure the same recompense to every man regardless of whether he produces much or little, so that some men more able or more conscientious in their work would be deprived of a part of their product for the benefit of others less able or less scrupulous. And yet the land reformer and the socialist have much in common. Land reform itself is of necessity a part of the socialist program, and the land reform of the socialist is not so different from that of the land reformer, except that the socialist fails to appreciate the fundamental sufficiency of land reform to bring about, in an easy and natural way, that regeneration of society which he hopes to force by his artificial program. Land reform and capital. The socialist places undue stress upon the importance of the possession of machinery by the people as well as the possession of the earth, but the land reformer claims that with free access to the earth, man will produce machinery as fast as they need it. All the machinery of the world is produced now by labor every 10 or 15 years. There is surely little machinery in practical use in the world today that is more than 20 years old. Wear and depreciation soon send all kinds of machines and tools and implements to the junk pile to be replaced with labor's current product. With land reform, the machinery question would take care of itself. And the same is true of the question of capital, which in large degree is merely another name for machinery and other material equipment of like character. Men and land can produce capital to meet all human requirements. That is the way all the capital of the past and present has been produced, and the output will be none the less when labor is producing capital for itself than it is when labor is producing capital for the capitalists. Nor will the mooted question of interest give much cause for concern under land reform. Capital is only wealth used in production, and when once the barriers have been taken down that now stand in the way of the full use of the earth by labor in the production of wealth, surplus wealth for further production will spring into being as if to the call of the magician, and with this abundance of capital, interest becomes a less and less important factor. It is not inconceivable that the time may come when the man with a surplus will be glad to lend it for its care and keep, content with the certainty of getting it back intact when wanted and asking no pay for its use beyond this reciprocal service. Indeed, instead of loaning money out at interest, men may some day be willing to pay a percentage to have their money cared for, awaiting the time when they wish to use it. The man with money would have lost forever the power to live by means of his money at the expense of his fellows. The only thing that a man would need or desire to do with his surplus wealth would be to use it himself in further production or to consume it. However unlikely such a result may seem to those accustomed to consider the question of interest only in light of present conditions, it will still be easy to understand that the righteousness or unrighteousness of interest will cut little figure when capital has become widely diffused, and when the producers themselves are the capitalists. The Golden Age. But the socialists are deeply concerned over the waste of present methods of production under the competitive system. They wish to seize upon the great industrial trusts and combinations and use them for the benefit of all men alike. In this way it is claimed that humanity can produce more goods and by less effort than in any other, and that all will share equally in the results. To this the land reformers make no reply except that it is vastly more important that men should be free to produce what they please and as much as they please than that they should produce much with little effort, and that it is incomparably more just that every man have exactly what he produces, be it much or little, than that all men should have precisely the same amount from the joint product. And it is certainly an open question whether much of the waste of the competitive system is not more likely to be saved through the voluntary cooperation that is bound to follow hard upon land reform than it would be under the enforced combinations of socialism. It would be an exceedingly sanguine socialist who would expect to inaugurate the socialistic program without the long struggle of an industrial and more than likely a political revolution. Socialism certainly cannot expect to be able to take over for the public the existing trusts and monopolies, which would surely go to pieces in any contest in which the present order was so badly worsted. If they are to have great industrial combinations for the saving of waste in their socialistic era, they will have to do the organizing and the combining all over again after they bring in their regime. It is worthwhile to consider, therefore, that many of the good things that the socialists hope to accomplish by force would come about easily and of their own weight under a right land system. In the first place, land reform would result naturally in the taking over by the public of all monopolies founded on land monopoly, especially those concerned with transportation and communication, which since franchise values, right-of-way values, and terminal values, being in essence mere land values, would be absorbed back through taxation or otherwise by the society that gave them existence. And in addition, land reform would be followed by an era of cooperative endeavor that would bring in its wake all the promised economic blessings of socialism without its harsh and unsavory limitations. With free access to land, men would be less and less inclined to work for others. Employers would have to bid against the high wage of the land, and the wage system would have to take on profit sharing, which we have seen to be only product sharing, features in an ever increasing degree. Then, too, with wealth more plentiful and more evenly distributed, it would be easy for working men, consulting their own tastes and temperament, to unite in manufacturing and mercantile enterprises for themselves, in which they would be their own employers just as much as if they were engaged in agriculture on the land. All industry would tend to organize itself on this basis, and yet there could be no restriction of individual liberty, since every man would be free to cooperate or not as he pleased. Without doubt, the tendency would be toward monopoly, but it would be a monopoly in which the price of the output could never be raised arbitrarily, because the land, free of access to all who might wish to compete or to produce for themselves, would have its regulating influence upon the price of commodities just as upon the price of labor. Thus the land, acting as a regulator for everything else, would make every man his own master. He could enter any vocation he pleased and change when he pleased, assured that what he produced would be his own, and that he would receive in addition his equal share of every free gift of the Almighty. To the human race. Still, some men, less capable, would be poor, but even the poor man could enjoy the necessities and comforts of life, with the opportunity ever present of bettering his condition to just the extent of his industry and prudence. Poverty, as we now see it in the world, would be unknown except in cases of sickness or helplessness or laziness, and society, out of the abundance of its possessions, could deal bountifully with those in misfortune, while the indolent would reap their just reward of privation, and sickness and helplessness would become less and less common as humanity secured its release from the disease-breeding conditions in the great centers of population and from the hurry and worry of our monopoly-driven civilization. And even laziness would find for itself a less excuse when each man could be sure that his work was for himself and not for the benefit of a lot of economic parasites.